remember, Descartes has used his hyperbolic doubt, both dream doubt and evil demon doubt, to throw himself into this global skepticism where he can't believe anything, right? He's in a position where none of the beliefs that he formerly thought were true are actually true, right? And this is a pretty devastating position to be in, right? I just don't know if anything is true. He says, maybe the only thing that I know with certainty is that nothing is certain. But then he has this idea, wait a second, if there is somebody who is being deceived, if deception is occurring, there must be somebody who is undergoing the deception, right? So it might be that the tree I see outside my window is really just the production of my subjective imagination in an elaborate dream. But even if that were the case, even if when I see the tree and the tree weren't real, it weren't really out there in the objective world, independently of my mind, there's still something that it seems like to see the tree, right? There's still an experience of seeing a tree, even if the tree isn't really there. So in order for there to be any experience at all, in order for there to be anything it's like to have an experience at all, there must be somebody there to have the experience. Yeah. And so Descartes says, well, if I'm doubting, then there's got to be somebody who's doubting. If I'm thinking, there's got to be somebody who's thinking. And so therefore, since there is thinking, I know that there is somebody who is thinking. I exist, I think, therefore I exist. Yeah. And then Descartes says, okay, so I exist. What's the nature of this existence? And he says, well, look, I know something about physical bodies. Physical bodies are extended in space and they occupy a particular location, right? They occupy a particular place and they're extended in space. That's what I mean by a physical body. Physical bodies are extended and they're unthinking things. But the fundamental feature of the mind is to think. Yeah. So one of the interesting things here is that Descartes says, look, I have an idea of physical bodies, but it might be that my idea of the physical body doesn't really correspond to anything existing out there in the world. And it might just be that I exist purely as a mind. And this is in fact what the melting wax example is going to help us see. Descartes says, I'm going to use this example to help show that what I know with more certainty than anything else is that my mind exists. Right, that I exist as a thinking thing. And that being a thinking thing is in some sense fundamentally distinct from being a physical thing. So the melting wax example is going to help us get sort of a further coalescing of this cogito argument, the idea that I think, therefore I exist, by establishing the primacy of mental existence, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and start taking a look at what Descartes does here. And so the way I've broken this down is I just want us to follow along Descartes' sort of, it's kind of a process, like just like with the cogito. It's not like a straightforward, here are my premises, here's the conclusion. It's kind of like, hey, let's undertake this meditation together. And so we're going to meditate on this piece of wax. Okay. So, and really this starts out as Descartes saying, hey, I need to get very clear, since I've established myself as a thinking thing, the res cogitans, right? Remember, res cogitans, res means thing, cogitans means thinking. So thinking thing, he says, I'm a thinking thing. He says, okay, in order to get really clear on this, I need to make sure I have a very solid conception of what a physical body is. The res extenda, the res extensa, the extended thing. So he's going to undertake this meditation to really help solidify this conception of a physical body and where that stands in the relation to what he can know about his mind. Okay, so instead of trying to think about physical objects generally, right? Because you just can kind of be overwhelmed if you try and think about all physical objects. He's going to take a particular example. And he takes this idea of a piece of wax, right? And he says, All right, this wax, it's been taken straight from the honeycomb. So fresh, right? Fresh from the honeycomb. It still has its sweet taste, and the smell of flowers lingers on the wax. It has this golden color, right? And its shape and its size are obvious. It's hard and it's cold and it's easy to touch, and it makes a sound when you strike it on something, right? You strike it on the table and it's hard, right? So it makes a sound. So it's got all these properties, right, that you perceive directly when you take it from the honeycomb. And Descartes asks, so how is it that you are grasping the wax? How is it that you're making sense of this piece of wax, right? So, I mean, what do you think? Like, how are you knowing the piece of wax in in this instance, in the example that Descartes is giving here? How do you come to know about the piece of wax? How is it that you're gaining knowledge of it, right? What's going on there?
Through your senses.
Yeah, through your senses, right? You taste it, right? It's got this sweet, lovely taste. You smell it. It smells like flowers. It's got this color, so you see this golden color, and you can make out its shape and its size, right? And when you hit it on stuff, it makes a noise, right? You can hear it, right? And it looks like at this point, the way in which you're knowing about the wax is through your senses, right? You've taken the piece of wax out, and you're getting all this information through your senses. Okay, so that seems pretty straightforward. And it does kind of seem like, hey, that's how we learn about physical objects. We go out into the world and we interact with them with our senses. We see them, we touch them, we taste them, we feel, we use our sensory modalities to understand the physical things in the world. And that seems like a pretty standard and straightforward way of understanding what's happening there. But, okay, so what Descartes does here now is he takes the piece of wax, and maybe he picks up some tongs. He's sitting in front of his fire, and he places the piece of wax over the fire. Okay. And when he does that, the sensory properties of the wax begin to change. So it loses its taste. Yeah. That sweet taste, which was originally there in the piece of wax, is now gone. The smell of flowers disappears. Its shape and its size begin to change. It becomes difficult to touch, right? So it's no longer even a solid, right? It turns into a liquid. Maybe you collect the liquid into some kind of jar or something like that. And it no longer makes a sound because you can't even strike it on something. Okay, so we see what Descartes' done here is taken the wax, he's placed it over the fire, and then all of its sensory properties have now changed. And so all the features by which I said I previously knew the piece of wax, those are gone, right? I said I knew it because of its taste, its smell, its shape, its size, its color, its sound. But now all of that has changed when I've placed it over the fire and it's melted. And Descartes asked, is it the same? So am I perceiving the same piece of wax at this point? Is it the same piece of wax? Or is it a totally different piece of wax? What do you think? Yeah, so that's what Descartes says. He says, yeah, it's the same piece of wax, obviously. It's not like that previous piece of wax has gone out of existence and now a new piece of wax has come into existence. It's the same piece of wax. It's just that its conditions are different, right? The properties have changed, right? But it's the same piece of wax that I'm grasping. Okay, so here's the issue, though. If I'm perceiving the same piece of wax, but all the characteristics of the wax by which I previously knew it have changed, then how is it that I'm perceiving the same piece of wax? Right? You see the problem there? Because if the way in which I knew that piece of wax was through its sensory properties, But all of those sensory properties have changed. And I still want to say that I'm grasping the piece of wax. It can't be that I knew the wax in that previous instance through its sensory properties, because they're all gone. And yet I still want to say it's the same piece of wax. But how can I say that if everything I used to identify the wax originally has vanished? What is it that I'm comprehending in the wax through all of these modifications and changes? Descartes says, certainly nothing that I reach with senses. For while everything having to do with taste, smell, sight, touch, and hearing has changed, the same piece of wax remains. So you see what Descartes' getting at here is, hey, I seemed to perceive the wax through my senses, right? Through these sensory modalities. But all of those sensory modalities by which I perceive the wax, all that's gone. And yet I'm perceiving the same piece of wax. I'm still able to identify it as the piece of wax. So what is it that I'm using to identify the piece of wax if it's not these sensory properties? Descartes thinks it's got to be something else that's actually going on when I grasp the wax. It can't be that the way I'm knowing about the wax is through my senses, because all those have changed, and yet I'm still grasping the same piece of wax. So how could it be that those senses were how I knew about the piece of wax? It's got to be something else going on, right? He says, removing everything that doesn't belong to the wax, let's see what's left. Nothing is left except an extended, flexible, and changeable thing. Okay, so all the sensory properties are gone, right, that we previously identified it with. Now, one of the interesting things that Pupak was just pointing out is, hey, it's a change. We've recognized, we've seen its transformation, right? We've seen it have these properties and then transform to no longer having those properties. So we know it's a changeable thing. And we can also see that it's extended. That is, it takes up space, right? And in that sense, it's measurable. Yeah, it might not be the same size as it previously was, but it still takes up space. And it's flexible, right? I can mold it into different shapes. If I put it into a mold of a triangle, it will turn into a triangle, a circle, etc. Right? Okay, so now, so extension, flexibility, and changeability. These aren't, Descartes thinks, perceptible properties of the wax. Yeah, these are not things that I'm strictly perceiving with my senses. Descartes says, hey, these are properties of the wax that I'm grasping through my mind, through my understanding, not through my senses. What I'm actually grasping here is the idea of a physical body. That is what I'm grasping. The senses are secondary. Really, when I'm able to perceive that the same piece of wax persists through its various stages of transformation, right? It goes from state A, when it has its color and its smell and its taste. We put it through the fire, it melts, it loses all of those sensory qualities. And yet I still am able to grasp that it's the same piece of wax. Descartes says that's because what I'm grasping is fundamentally the idea of the wax and not its sensory properties, such that I can continue to grasp it even when its sensory properties have changed. Okay, I can anticipate an objection here, I think, because I would say you might want to push back on that and say, wait a second, don't I grasp its extension, its flexibility, and its changeability through the senses? I mean, because look, it's got to be in a particular place, right? And the only way I can identify the place it's in is by seeing it, right? The only way in which I can know about its flexibility is by seeing it change from one shape to another, and so on and so forth. So you might say, hey, those aren't purely properties of the mind. I perceive its extension and its flexibility and its changeability through my senses. It might be that the particular properties of the wax have changed, but I'm still seeing these fundamental characteristics of the piece of wax. And Descartes says, okay, well, that's sort of a reasonable objection to raise there, but what does it really mean for something to be flexible and changeable? Yeah, let's think about that for a second. Because it doesn't seem like what it means for something to be flexible or changeable is that it has some kind of sensory property, right? Because if I can take the piece of wax, I put it into a mold, and I can make different shapes out of it. I could turn it into a square, into a circle, into a triangle. I can change it into a myriad of different shapes. In fact, the shape of the wax can change in innumerable ways. In fact, it can change in so many different ways that I'm not even capable of picturing all of the myriad transformations that the wax could possibly undergo. So when I perceive the changeability of the wax, you might say, yes, there's a particular instance of perception when I see it move from one state to another, but how is it that I'm identifying it as the same piece of wax? The identification doesn't come through my senses. If I see a change, I could change it in another way, and in yet another way, and in yet another way, and put it through an infinite series of transformations and still say, hey, it's the same piece of wax. That's because what I'm grasping, according to Descartes, at the very basic level, is the idea of a physical object, the very idea of an extended thing. Yeah, so its changeability and its flexibility is not, strictly speaking, something I perceive through my senses. It's something I'm understanding, right? So you might say, but I see it change from one state to another. But Descartes says, yeah, but you can do that an infinite number of times. And when you do it, you're still going to recognize the same piece of wax. That's because what's happening is, even though all the sensory properties are changing, you have a grasp of the idea of the piece of wax in your mind. And that's what enables you to identify the wax across its various stages of transformation, is because you have the idea of it. Yeah?
Excuse me, but the first step was observations, and
Yeah.
then the grasping comes next. So how come we can just delete the observation part?
Yeah, okay. So how can we just delete the observation part? That's a really good question. So when we grasped the piece of wax, the first thing we wanted to say was, hey, well, we're getting this through our senses, right? So I'm seeing it, I'm touching it, I'm tasting it, I'm smelling it. And Descartes, and so the intuition there is to say, oh, okay, and that's what my understanding of the piece of wax consists in. What Descartes wants to say is, actually, no, none of that's essential. You don't actually need, so for instance, I could just perceive something that tastes sweet and not be able to identify what it is, right? If I didn't have the idea of a physical body, for instance, that could be the basis of the unification of all of the sensory modalities that I'm using, then there wouldn't be anything particular there, right? It would just be like, you know, this weird sort of sudden occurrence of an olfactory sense or a taste or a visual impression not attached to anything else. Descartes wants to say, look, what really enables me to use my senses to pick out the piece of wax is that already before those senses are even activated, I've already got the idea of a physical body. My idea is prior to the sensory perception. And the only way I can make coherent sense out of the sensory impression that I'm having is because I have an idea in my mind that is unifying those various sensory modalities. And that's why we can delete the senses or the observation and say, hey, it's not fundamental to what's going on there. Really, what's fundamental is I'm bringing my idea to the sense perceptions rather than the sense perceptions forming the idea in my mind. I've got the idea there first. Yeah, so when we're talking about cognition, we want to put this in terms of cognition. I think for Descartes wants to say, well, cognition fundamentally, right, is about what is going on in our understanding. Like that's the primary source of what we want to call the experiencing subject. It's not the senses, it's not the body, it's the mind, it's the ideas in the mind which are primary and more fundamental than anything else. Which seems like a weird idea if you like, because we interact in the world using our sensory modalities. But what Descartes is saying is, hey, those only ever give us indirect evidence of objects, right? Because we can see in the case of the wax that the wax changes all of its sensory properties. So it can't be the sensory properties by which I identify the nature of the wax. What I really know about the wax is the idea I have of it in my mind. Descartes wants to say, hey, look, what's fundamental here is what's going on at the level of the mind. Just like when I learned about my own existence, I learned about my own existence as a thinking being, right? As a purely mental existence. In fact, it might not even be the case that I have a body because I can't know anything about that with any certainty. What I can fundamentally know is that I have this idea of myself. And I can't doubt it. There's no way I can doubt this idea of myself. It just seems to be what is there fundamentally in the mind. And what Descartes is saying here is that, hey, okay, so what I grasp clearly and distinctly when I grasp the piece of wax are not its sensory properties. It's not its accidents or modifications. It's actually a mathematical idea in the mind. It's a purely abstract idea that I'm grasping when I identify the piece of wax from one stage to another, from one point in time to another point in time. It's the idea of extension. It's the idea of a body which is extended in space and occupies a physical location. And I don't want to say it's just an idea, but it's an idea in the mind. And it's nothing that I'm strictly speaking, identifying through the senses. The senses are secondary to all of that. What's primary is that the idea is occurring in my mind, because it might be the case that I'm deceived about everything which is really going on out there in the world, right? But even if I were deceived about all of that stuff, there's still an idea in my mind, yeah? The tree might not really exist, but I've got the idea of the tree in my mind. So I know my idea of a physical body exists in my mind, even if I don't know whether or not physical bodies actually exist. And Descartes thinks this is just the idea of a physical substance. He says, my grasp of the wax is not visual, tactile, or pictorial. Despite the appearance, despite the way it appears to me, I have never had a sensory grasp of what the wax is. Rather, my grasp of the wax is the result of a purely mental inspection. Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting way of looking at things, right? You think, well, I thought the way in which I knew about the world was through my senses, but now after having read some Descartes, I can see that all of the things I perceive or recognize or have cognitions of in the physical world are really fundamentally ideas occurring in my mind. Yeah, no, I get the intuition there too. And you might say, look, how do children learn to, for instance, recognize objects in the world? It seems like, there's a period of time where they're just taking in sensory stimuli. And isn't like really any concrete recognition that, this is a dog or, any physical, the concept of having the concept of any physical thing. It takes some time for them to gain the concepts by which they can then recognize or make sense of the sensory experiences that they're undergoing. So you might say, well, then aren't the senses prior? And I feel do like, aren't the senses somehow fundamental? You can't just get rid of those because you need those to get to the understanding. Descartes thinks that picture is not actually right. If we were to just for a moment go back to admitting that the physical world exists, right? Descartes wants to say, well, how do I ever gain actual knowledge about that world? Okay, so we're just setting aside dream doubt for a moment, because Descartes ultimately sets that aside. And he says there is a physical world, and he wants to know how we know about it, right? So let's set that aside and let's just say, hey, obviously there is really a physical world out there. How do we gain knowledge of that physical world? Well, Descartes wants to say, all the senses ever do is indirectly activate ideas in the mind, right? So even if you're thinking about this in terms of child development, right, or development of cognition in young children, I think the kind of picture that Descartes wants to point out is that the way in which the child begins to make sense of their sensory experience is when they get the concepts to identify the types of things they're encountering, right? So the way in which I know, for instance, that the tree is out there, I might get have these sensory stimuli, but if I don't have the concept of a physical substance, right, let alone a tree, then those sensory stimuli are just a chaotic confusion, right? It's just raw stuff, right? And there's no understanding, right? There would be nothing to sort of unify the various perceptions that are occurring in that experience. So what is primary there in terms of our knowledge, in terms of our understanding, what we're grasping are the ideas that are activated in the mind. Those are what are fundamental in a case like that, right? So Descartes wants to say the senses don't give us definitive knowledge. Where we get knowledge is through the ideas in the mind. Yeah, that's what's primary. Because, again, I could be we know that we're deceived about, our senses can be very much deceived. And the way in which we correct that is by using our understanding, right? So if I see an object far away, a large object far away, it seems small. And the senses aren't very reliable in a case like that. And Descartes says, well, and how do we correct that? Well, we bring in the laws of optics, right, which are mathematical laws. And then we come to a mental understanding of what's going on. So our knowledge there is at the level of the mind. It's at the level of ideas. And so the point that Descartes wants to make here then is that I know my mind, what's going on in my mind, way more clearly than I know anything about the sensory world. I have in my mind this idea of a physical body. And I kind of know what that means, right? It means that it's extended in space and time, that it occupies a particular location. But at this stage in the meditation, Descartes saying, look, that could be an idea in my mind, and I know nothing about whether or not it actually exists. But I do know that it's an idea occurring in the mind. So to try and help with this, we say that we see the wax when it's present, right? And when we say we see it, we are using a concept that relies on a sensory modality. The sensory modality is sight. And so that can make it seem like the way in which we're understanding it is through our senses. But Descartes says, strictly speaking, we're not seeing the wax at all, right? We're grasping the idea of the wax in our mind. we are understanding the idea of a physical object, of a physical body. That's the idea which is being activated in the mind. Now, it could be just that the screen of experience is just it's like our experience is just our subjective imagination is projecting this experience onto the screen of our mind, and it's all just an illusion, right? That's what Descartes' methodological doubt has gotten him to. But even if it's all an illusion, I'm still clearly, the idea of the physical body still occurring in my mind. Yeah, even if it's illusory, even if no physical body really exists, I've still got the idea. So it's through my mind, my judgment, in particular here, a kind of mathematical judgment, that I most clearly and distinctly grasp the wax. It's not by way of the senses. And just interestingly, this understanding of physical bodies does pave the way for modern physics. Like, how do we understand physical bodies? We understand them through measurement. And that's the idea that Descartes is saying he has in his mind of a physical body, is to be extended. And what you'll see when you start reading the sixth meditation is Descartes going to say, and I can know that my idea of a physical body really does correspond to something out there in the world. Right? But the understanding where that's happening is at the level of the mind. And so in that sense, the mind is more fundamental or more clearly known than the physical body. I'm going to pass over this last comment here. It just has to do with that comment about physics and the idea that the idea of a physical body we have, the res extensa, extended in space and time, is the idea of something that can be measured. Right? And this is really the concept of matter that modern physics adopts, right? I know it's way more complicated than that, but we see the basics of it here being developed in Descartes. And Descartes says, look, the very idea of physical body is the idea of an extended thing. Okay, so I need to run through this quick so we have time to get into our groups. So what I grasp when I grasp the idea of the wax is the idea of a physical body. Okay, just the idea. And the essence of physical bodies is extension, right? So that's what Descartes is saying is essential to any physical thing that I think I'm grasping, is I have in my mind the idea of an extended thing. To be a physical thing essentially is to be extended in space, is to be measurable, and to occupy a physical location. This is the res extensa, right? The extended thing. But this idea of the body is still only an idea in my mind. So it's not that I'm grasping a physical body out there in the world when I grasp the piece of wax. What I'm grasping is an idea in the mind. And further philosophical investigation is going to be needed to carry, we need to carry that out in order to determine whether that idea of a physical body really corresponds to a real objective physical world. So we don't know that yet. All we know is that there's an idea in my mind. Just like I had the idea of myself. Okay, so here is the main point that we want to stress for Descartes. I now know that physical objects are not really known through sensation or imagination, but are grasped by the understanding alone. And from the fact that physical objects are grasped in virtue of their being understandable rather than tangible or visible, I infer that I can't know anything more easily or plainly than my mind. That's what I know most fundamentally. I know that with more certainty than anything else. I might be wrong that my idea of a physical body corresponds to a real physical body out there in the world, but I know I'm grasping the idea. That's more clear than anything else, right? I've got the idea in my mind. I can't even be deceived about that, because if the idea is occurring in my mind, it just is occurring in my mind, right? How could I be deceived about that? I could be deceived about whether or not it really corresponds to something out there in the world, but I can't be deceived that the idea is occurring in my mind. So that's what I know. I know that these ideas, that the mind exists because these ideas occur in it. There are these instances of thinking. Yeah. So the mind is more fundamentally known than the body. Now, the mind isn't a physical thing, according to Descartes. He calls it the res cogitans. It's a thinking thing, and it's unextended, right? So the mind for Descartes, it doesn't take up any space. It doesn't occur anywhere. You might say there is there does seem to be a temporal sequence to, right, mental states. Like, so one idea occurs after another idea. So time still seems to be a factor there, but it doesn't seem like our ideas are occurring anywhere. So they're not extended in space. And another way of thinking about this is like physical objects are extended in space, so we can measure them, but we can't measure our mental states, right? We can't measure our experiences in the way in which we can measure a physical thing. I mean, that would be sort of weird, right? Let me measure your experience of the beautiful sunset. Be like, well, how the heck are you going to do that? I might tell you it was very beautiful, but that's not like being able to measure the depth of the ocean floor or something. Yeah, I can't measure your mind. I can measure your brain, but that's because your brain is a physical thing, right? Physical substance. We could take it apart, break it down into its little pieces, figure out how all the neurons and neural networks interconnect to form this, massive lump of gray matter which sits on the top of our neck. But I don't ever seem to be able to measure the mind in that kind of way. So the mind doesn't seem to be extended. The body, of course, that's extended. And it looks like the body is not a thinking thing, right? Because what is essential to being a physical object is not that it has thoughts. That's what's essential to being a mind. What's essential to being a body is that it's extended in space. So that's the res cogitans, the thinking thing, and the res extensa, the extended thing. Those are just the fancy Latin terms that Descartes uses to describe them, but they give us a sort of a deeper connotation of the meaning, right? The thinking thing, the extended thing. And while I know more certainly than anything else that my mind exists, it may be that the body does not. We don't know that at this point, right? We just know that I exist, I think, therefore I am. Ideas occur in the mind. I know the mind more fundamentally than I know the physical body. And what Descartes wants to say here, and this is going to set up for us the discussion next week about substance dualism, Descartes wants to say, if I can know my mind with more certainty than I can know my body, then my mind is fundamentally different and distinct from my body. Yeah, they're two different things. The essence of mind is thinking. Yeah, and to not be extended, right? So thinking and not occurring in any particular place. The essence of a body is to be extended and non-thinking. So they're two clear and distinct ideas, which are separate from each other. And Descartes says, I learned this by way of learning about my own existence, that my mind is fundamentally distinct from my body. And so it seems conceivable, even on this view, that my mind could exist without my body. Yeah, the body is just a corpse for Descartes, right? Corpse, body, right? So we see many physical bodies, many extended things, but the mind is like fundamentally different than that, right? Its fundamental nature is to have an awareness of its own experiences. And so it's got to be a totally different kind of thing than the body. Here's actually the first argument for dualism. I'm just going to present this to you quickly, and I know there's a lot of issues that we want to talk about here, and that you have probably objections and questions and comments you want to raise. But I'm going to do this quickly right now. When we come back next week, we'll look at it in more detail. So here's the idea for the first argument that I think we can pull out for substance dualism in Descartes. He says, knowledge of your own existence as a thinking thing is more certain than knowledge of any physical thing. I know that I exist with absolute certainty, but I'm still doubtful about whether physical bodies exist. And he says, if I can know with more certainty that I exist as a thinking thing than I can that I have a body, it's possible for my mind to exist without my body. And if it's possible for my mind to exist without my body, then the mind really is distinct from the body. So it's possible for my mind to exist without my body. And Descartes says, and what this shows us is that the mind is a non-physical thing. It's not like a body, it's non-physical. It is a mental substance as opposed to a physical substance. A purely non-physical mental thing. Okay. And there's an interesting question. I mean, what kind of thing is that, right? What does it mean to be non-physical? Yeah. This is the idea we're going to be unpacking in the lecture next week.